Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit of. Later on tonight, I'll be doing another video on Wendy Williams, but right now I'm here to talk about Eddie Guerrero, the passing of Eddie Guerrero. Um 20 years today, well, 20 years yesterday since the passing of Eddie Guerrero, and he was a wrestler that I really, really enjoyed his work, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. A friend of mine uh, came over, and he knows that all my friends that I grew up with, they know I was a huge wrestling fan since forever. They said, "Did you hear about that wrestler Eddie Guerrero, Hispanic wrestler that passed away?" And I didn't hear about it at that time, so I looked it up. Went to looked it up on Yahoo at that time. Google was just in the Stone Ages in 2005. Looked it up and heard, wow, Eddie Guerrero, heart attack in Minneapolis, Minnesota, passed away. So let's get into a little bit about his career and his life. He was born, of course, the son of Gory Guerrero, second generation wrestler, father, legendary promoter in both the city of El Paso as well as in in Mexico. But he was the youngest son of Gory. So the other sons, they were already accomplished. Chavo Senior, Mondo, Hector, they were all, wrestling. But Eddie, he was the younger boy, and he wrestled in college. He wrestled in high school, but pretty soon, he broke into the pros. And obviously, his father being a promoter in Mexico, he broke in the AAA promotion in first, and he had his first tryout, believe it or not, with WWE in 1986. Right, he wrestled Terry Funk on a TV taping. So, two Texas wrestlers, Terry Funk and Eddie Guerrero, wrestling. Yeah, young Eddie Guerrero, but he really didn't break out as far as that. So he went back to Mexico, and it was here in Mexico in his second run that he formed a tag team called Los Gringos Locos with Art Barr, faction slash tag team with Art Barr. And they were one of the best tag teams, in AAA in the 90s. So much so that when WCW had the first World's Collide paper, they were featured on there in a tag team match. And this was in 1994. And that got the attention of uh, that got that's my cat Oreo. That got the attention of the promoters in WCW because Eric Bischoff was looking to tap into the luchador market. Why? Because Paul Heyman had already done it. Paul Heyman took over ECW in 1993. We talked about it several times before on this channel, how ECW came into existence. And when he took it over, he was looking to expand the scope of wrestling, because wrestling at that time, 1993, 1994, 1995, these were the years in professional wrestling that were like the dark years, years of a wrestling depression, because WCW lacked direction. That they were a revolving door. You had your Kip Fries, you had your Bill Wattses. Bill Watts in 1992, the interview with Wade Keller is discovered, and he makes racist comments and homophobic comments, and it gets back to Hank Aaron, who was in charge of Turner Sports at the time, and obviously Hank Aaron, having dealt with racism before in wrestling, not in wrestling, in baseball rather, has no tolerance for bigots like Bill Watts. So Bill Watts gets fired from WCW. They're looking for a new person. They're done with wrestling people. It didn't work out with Jim Herd. It didn't work out with Kip Fry. It didn't work out with Bill Watts. It didn't work out when they brought Dusty Rhodes back. So they're done with wrestling people. They're looking for more television people. So they reach out to the third string announcer, Eric Bischoff. They have, a lot of people apply for this job: Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, Eric Bischoff. But Eric Bischoff gets the job. But also what happened was Paul Heyman, who was a manager at that time, was fired and let go once Bischoff took over. So he, looking for a job, Paul Heyman, decides he's going to get a job from his friend that he worked with in the Memphis territory, Eddie Gilbert. And Eddie Gilbert brings him in initially just as an announcer and a manager for Sabu in Eastern Championship Wrestling, because now Todd Gordon has now taken over Eastern Championship Wrestling from its original owner, who established it back in 1989 as Tri-State Wrestling. That guy, Joel Goodhart, went out of business. And Eddie Gilbert and Todd Gordon have now taken it over. But Eddie Gilbert passes away. So they need a new booker. So Heyman's already there. They put Heyman in charge. And it was then that Heyman decides he's going to change the direction of professional wrestling. Professional wrestling is stale in the big two promotions in WCW and WWF. So he's going to showcase more international stars. Eddie Guerrero is one of those international stars. Psychosis, Rey Mysterio, they all end up there. Chris Benoit, who he gets from Japan, Dean Malenko, who he gets from Japan. They had some exposure, like I said, in 1986 in WWE and 1989 in WCW. But overall, they really weren't known within the U.S. besides that When Worlds Collide pay-per-view. So Eddie Guerrero's there. He forms a tag team with Too Cold Scorpio, who has come over from WCW as well. And they win the tag team championships. But Eric Bischoff is now looking at what Paul Heyman is doing and saying that it will benefit WCW. So what does he do? In early 1995, he has a talent raid of all of ECW, of the main mid-card of ECW. This includes Dean Malenko. This includes Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero in 1995 in ECW. They have what they call, and look this match up. If you guys are interested in seeing the talent of Eddie Guerrero, look this match up on Peacock while it's still there, because the old footage from Peacock is still there. The Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko Classic, the Malenko Guerrero Classic. These two guys from Texas, two Texans, two second-generation wrestlers, classic stuff in ECW, showcasing a side of ECW that we don't often know. Because a lot of people look back at the history of ECW and they say, oh, ECW was about blood, ECW was about guts, ECW was about lesbians, ECW, hot lesbian action, Tommy Dreamer and Beulah McGillicuddy with Francine. He takes both, he's hardcore. Or Raven crucifying the Sandman on a cross, and the old Raven's cult storyline with Sandman's son. And ECW, or New Jack doing something crazy. And ECW was about that, but ECW during the early days, they had classic wrestling matches, and the Dean Malenko Eddie Guerrero Classic was absolutely one of those. But like I said, Eric Bischoff gets notice of this. And Eric Bischoff, like I said, raids ECW's talent. Public Enemy comes over. Dean Malenko comes over. Chris Benoit comes over. Rey Mysterio comes over, Psychosis comes over, and yes, Eddie Guerrero comes over. So immediate, because they're building the cruiserweight division. Light heavyweights were there in the early 90s. Bill Watts got rid of the light heavyweights. He didn't believe in a lot of the smaller wrestlers, but Eric Bischoff did. And in late 1995, he's building this cruiserweight division, and Eddie Guerrero is a huge part of it. Now they have the first pay-per-view that he appears in is Starrcade 1995. The story behind this is that that the WCW wrestlers, Bobby the Brain Heenan, who was announcer at WCW, has made a deal with Japanese wrestling promoters, played by Sonny Ono, to bring in Japanese wrestlers to take on, American wrestlers. So it's like the whole theme of 1995 Starrcade, besides the main event, it is Japan versus wrestlers from the Japanese wrestlers versus wrestlers from the United States. So Eddie Guerrero here appears on this show as well. But it's in 1996 that I think he really gets into his own, because in 1995 he did have a match with Ric Flair on one of the Nitros. He was supposed to wrestle Brian Pillman. Ric Flair and Brian Pillman were in the Four Horsemen at this time together, and they're showcasing his talent somewhat. But in 96, he finally gets into what I consider to be one of his early biggest feuds. They're pushing Diamond Dallas Page as a big star, and they wrestle each other, starting at Battle Bowl, and they feud with each other up until Starrcade 1996, when they feud over the United States Championship. Eddie is still a babyface at this point. But after a while, the babyface caricature of Eddie Guerrero fades away, right? Because here, this guy, Eddie Guerrero, he has a mullet. He has, he looks like he's out of, as President Trump would say, central casting of a 1980s professional wrestler. And it's kind of lame. Like, we're in 1996, we're moving away from the 80s. So he starts losing a series of matches. He has in the early part of 97, a U.S. championship match with Six from the NWO. That's the first ladder match in WCW history. When he starts losing these matches, and that's when he becomes a heel. He gets frustrated. And on one episode of Nitro, he comes out in street clothes. This is, late 1997 going into 1998. He comes out in street clothes and he starts talking about an incident where Eric Bischoff threw coffee in his face, right? And he says, this is in real life, backstage, because a lot of the big carders in WCW, they didn't feel like they were valued, especially the luchadores, because, of their ethnicity or whatever. Like, Eric Bischoff created the cruiserweight division, but that's where they were to stay at. You know what I mean? Like, they couldn't advance. Even though Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio Jr., they had their classic match at Halloween Havoc 97, their classic feuds over the United States Championship. He's wrestling the likes of Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, but he couldn't advance beyond that, right? It's like they were cruiserweights and they were designated with that. You know what I mean? They couldn't move up the ladder. So late 1997, early 1998, he does this work shoot promo where he talks about this real life incident where he's mad at Eric Bischoff, basically says that Eric Bischoff could kiss his ass, right? But what is he planning to do? He's planning to form his own faction of Mexican wrestlers called the LWO, a play on the NWO, obviously, which is the dominant faction in WCW, the Latino World Order. So he goes around and he recruits every Mexican star, La Parca, the Villanos, Juventud Guerrera, all the Mexican wrestlers. Juventud Guerrero by this point has lost his mask in a match with Chris Jericho. So he's recruiting everybody. So what about Ray? Ray and he still have the feud. They still have the feud going. They still have the feud going on. So he invites Ray to join the LWO. Ray declines. So Ray then has a match with LWO members, and he loses this match against the rest of the LWO. So he has to join the LWO begrudgingly. So he's a babyface. He's a babyface, even though he's in this heel faction. Rey Mysterio is. An interesting storyline. But at the end of 1998, the Finger Poke of Doom, the two factions of the NWO, which are the Wolfpack faction and the NWO Hollywood faction, they come back together. They come back together and they demand that the LWO be disbanded. They even attack Rey Mysterio, which leads to a tag team match with Rey Mysterio teaming with Conan, in which Rey Mysterio at Super Bowl IX in 1999 loses his mask. So the LWO is disbanded, and pretty much Eddie Guerrero does nothing until finally, WCW goes through a change in which, in their booking, in their backstage politics. The ratings are declining. The WWF is doing way better than WCW at this point. In the middle of the end of 1998, going into 1999, the Attitude Era is in full swing, and WCW is starting to really suffer ratings-wise. And the people at Turner are looking at Eric Bischoff like, I thought you were the golden boy. I thought you had all the secrets. You created the NWO, you created Crow Sting, you brought in Goldberg, you rejuvenated WCW. Why isn't it working anymore? Why are we failing? So by the end of Hog Wild 1998, Turner, a little bit after that, Turner just tells Eric Bischoff, don't come in anymore. And at this time also in the WWF, Vince Russo has left the WWF. He was the head writer of the WWF. Some would say that he was the brains behind the Attitude Era. Others would disagree and say it was more Vince McMahon. But he has left the WWF. He jumped ship. So in October of 99, he comes into WCW with a new pledge to push all those guys, all the Chris Benoits, the Eddie Guerreros, the Rey Mysterios, the Juventudes, all those guys that Eric Bischoff and his regime neglected in favor of the Hulk Hogan's and the Macho Mans. Those guys are and Ric Flair's, those guys are gonna be put out, and the newer talent is going to rise up, supposedly, according to what Vince Russo wants to do. And he does that for a while. And those guys like it because those guys get prominent positions, right? And Eddie Guerrero included. But then the ratings are still failing. It's not working. It's not happening fast enough, right? So they decide, okay, we're getting rid of Vince Russo again, and we're bringing in Kevin Sullivan, who was the booker under the Eric Bischoff regime. And what does Kevin Sullivan do? Kevin Sullivan immediately goes back to Super Bowl 10. The main event is Ric Flair versus, Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair. Like the old regime, old wrestlers, back in the saddle, as it were. And, Eddie Guerrero and his friend Shane Douglas, who was jumped from ECW to WCW, Conan, Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, and Chris Benoit, they're frustrated with it. They don't want Kevin Sullivan. They don't want to wrestle under Kevin Sullivan because, well, for one, Kevin Sullivan might have an axe to grind with regards to Chris Benoit because we know the story behind Chris Benoit and Kevin Sullivan. Chris Benoit was put into a feud with Kevin Sullivan. And in the storyline, a woman, Kevin Sullivan's real life wife, dumps Kevin Sullivan to be with Chris Benoit. But what happens? You know, they spend time on the road together, and then in real life, they end up hooking up in real life. And in real life, she ends up leaving Kevin Sullivan for Chris Benoit. So now you stole this guy's wife, and now you can't feel comfortable with him being in charge of your career. So they're like, no, if Vince Russo goes, we go. So all of them walk out. WWF doesn't want Conan for reasons because he was there in the early 90s and he had problems with them. They don't want Shane Douglas because he was there in 95 and they had problems with him. So they take everybody else, and Eddie Guerrero is included in that. So on an episode of Raw in 2000, all of a sudden you see all these, the mid-card of WCW, the heart of WCW, all these cruiserweights and all these mid-card guys sitting in the audience basically as hired guns of Triple H in his feud with Cactus Jack. And those are the Radicals, and that's your introduction to Eddie Guerrero in the WWF. And, he kind of flounders around a little bit after that until they hook him up with China. And that's when the magic is made initially in the early part of the year 2000, because he develops this Casanova character. It was during this time in WWF that, because of the way WWF is, it's more character driven. They develop his character, and he starts to do he starts to sound like a typical Mexican cholo, like, orale, vato, and all that stuff, right? He does that, and that becomes his gimmick, coming out there with a lowrider and China as his mamacita, right? And it really funny stuff, really great stuff. And you think he's really going places. But unfortunately, Eddie has issues, you know what I mean? And his issues are with HGH, painkillers, and alcohol. And it was after a show in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he gets drunk and he's behind the wheel and he gets into a car accident. You know what I mean? And after he got into his car accident, it becomes even worse because he was intoxicated. His problems become even worse. And unfortunately, even though he was doing really well with the storyline with China and stuff, the WWE has to let him go. And now his wife, Vicky, she wants to divorce him. His children, they don't want to addiction. And this accident, even getting into the accident again in Minneapolis.